morning, everyone. Thank you for staying here through the third day. It means either you're still open to new learning or you've got nothing better to do until your flight goes. So either way, you're here. It's an honor to be asked to do this. Somebody from the Little Apple, Manhattan, Kansas, Riley County Police Department. It is truly an honor to be here among a lot of people that are far brighter than I am and doing things far better than we are. And we're here to learn just like you are. Today I wanted to talk about changing the message in policing, or one of the messages in policing. I was recently at a ceremony where police executives from around the country were being recognized for their professional development. And one of the speakers commemorating the event said something very profound about a significant problem in policing, except he didn't intend to say it that way or to have it mean that. He said, "We in law enforcement are the only thing standing in the way between the innocent and those wishing to do them harm." I'm going to repeat that. We in law enforcement are the only thing standing in the way between the innocent and those wishing to do them harm. Emphasis added. Let's think about that for a moment and apply the math to it. The national average of police officers per 1,000 residents in U.S. cities is 1.7. That's higher here on the East Coast, but in most agencies, it's 1.7 or less. But let's forget that that definition includes everyone from the chief on down to the newest officer in the academy. And let's forget that of that 1.7, roughly 60% are assigned the duties we normally associate with that of a police officer, the road cop or the beat cop. And let's forget that 60% of that 60% are normally available for those duties. The other 40% being on some type of leave, or in training, or testifying in court, or a dozen other administrative activities, leaving the actual number closer to 0.6 of an officer per 1,000. But we're going to set that aside, and for a moment we're going to pretend that the entire 1.7 per 1,000 are available to stand in the way between the innocent and those wishing to do them harm. In my city, Manhattan, Kansas, there's about 55,000 residents, which means we should have around 93 police officers. And we've got a few more than that, but it's pretty close. So let's divide those 93 police officers by 3 time shifts, spread them across a 7-day week, and give them regular days off. The net result is that at any given moment, there are fewer than 20 police officers standing in the way between those wanting to do harm and those 55,000 people. If you're one of those 55,000 people, and in your own city you are, how do you like those odds? I think even the Spartans had it better than you do. Let me put this problem another way. Many of you have children. Suppose you're at a back-to-school night, and you're standing in the auditorium or the gym, you're listening to the principal. And at one point she says, "The only thing standing in the way between ignorance and your children are their teachers." Let me repeat that. The only thing standing in the way between ignorance and your children are their teachers. As a parent, what would you think about that? Would you accept the premise that you don't have a role in your child's education? Of course you wouldn't. Our education system is built on the idea that parents and the school and the community work together to create both the physical and the social environment necessary to foster learning. Why then wouldn't we want a law enforcement system built on the premise that the community and the police work together to create the physical and social environment necessary for safety and security? If someone breaks into your own house, do you defend it because you're a police officer, or do you defend it because it contains the people that you love? If someone breaks into your neighbor's house, do you come to his defense because you're a police officer, or because he's your neighbor and your friend? And don't you want your neighbor to come to the defense of you and your family, whether he's a police officer or not? Why is it then that so many in policing believe that we are the warriors, the only thing standing in the way between the innocent and those wishing to do them harm. Now, I don't fault the speaker entirely. I know him. He's actually an intelligent, dedicated professional. The problem is the message that our profession is sending him, that we really are warriors doing battle every day against the forces of evil. Or even worse, that we're the sheepdogs, protecting the mindless, helpless sheep from the wolves. The truth is, we are not warriors. We are not at war. Aaron said that very thing yesterday. We're peace officers. We're guardians. We're watchmen. Our visible presence serves as a reminder to the community that we're on watch at all times so that they can spend most of their time engaged in other roles. Our role just happens to be that of full-time instruments of safety and security. But if we're the only ones serving that role, our communities are going to be less safe than they should have to be. Now, I will grant you, as we've talked about the last couple of days, there is a time when the warrior cop, the combat cop, is the best and only solution to a problem. We just saw that in Orlando. And we have to train to be ready to answer that call when that role is necessary. But we can't let that role dominate our profession to the point where we truly believe that we are the only thing standing in the way between the innocent and those wishing to do them harm. Why is this distinction important? Why are we talking about this? Because the community that we serve, they do not want the dominant mindset to be that of a warrior for us as public servants. And that's who we are. We are public servants. We answer to the public. So at a time when they're calling for accountability and transparency and a greater voice in how their communities are being policed, we're calling for tactical gear and armored vehicles. Okay? At a time when they're asking for relationships and partnerships, we're asking for increased electronic surveillance and counterintelligence. And by the way, partnerships and relationships with the community, the best counterintelligence you're going to have. They want to believe in trust. We believe there are two kinds of people: those who have committed crimes and those who will commit crimes. They want police officers. We want to be combat cops. If we continue down the path where the warrior mindset dominates our profession, at best we're going to have change forced upon us, change that we don't have a voice in. It's already happening now, maybe at some of your own agencies. At worst, we're going to face a community that sees us as an illegitimate authority, an occupying army, a community whose compliance depends solely upon our ability to impose punishment. So how do we change that message? How do we redirect the conversation away from the dominance of the warrior and more towards the peace officer, the guardian, the watchman? I believe there are three things that we can do, three things we must do in order to start changing that message. The first thing is hire the right people. Now, we know that inside almost every police officer applicant, there's someone who wants to drive fast and arrest bad guys. And some of them will admit it to you if you ask them. And guess what? They're going to have to be able to do that. There's no doubt about that. The other 99.9% of the time, they're going to be working with other people to solve problems. Citizens, fellow officers, urban planning, public works, advocacy groups, racial and ethnic minorities. Most of the time, these people are going to be cooperative and willing to solve problems. Sometimes they won't be. Regardless, your officers are going to have to work with all of them every day. Find a way to test a candidate's capacity to work with others, to solve problems, and collaborate with people like them and with people who are very different. Someone who can learn to do that well can be taught to drive fast and arrest bad guys. So, hire the right people. That's the first step. Second thing we must do is train the right way. And here I will be really specific. There's only one nationally recognized training model that was designed specifically to teach problem solving and collaboration. PTO model, Police Training Officer Program. It's the only national model that was first built on research into what police agencies across the country actually expect from their officers on a daily basis. It's the only national model that uses adult learning strategies to teach trainers and trainees. It's the only national model to promote the value of emotional intelligence in policing. It's the only national model that separates coaching, training, and mentoring, the most important aspects of recruit development, from evaluation. And it's the only national model that uses real-world problems as the hub for learning, the kind of problems officers will face every day. If you're an agency that says you're involved with community policing or community engagement or problem solving, and you're not a PTO agency, I'd like to hear the rationalization from your chief of police or your commissioner. And if you're one of those agencies that's not PTO, but you're looking to become one, and you're scouting the landscape for agencies that are PTO agencies, if one tells you, come visit us, we know exactly what we're doing, we have PTO exactly right, run away from them as fast as you can. The agency you want to visit is the one that says, you know, we do some of these things right. We're still struggling with some elements. You're welcome to come, take a look at what we're doing, maybe you can offer some advice. Those are the people that you want to talk to. So, back to changing the message. First, we have to hire the right people. Second, we have to train them the right way. And third, we have to promote the right behaviors, both internally and externally, in and out. We talked about that yesterday when we talked about culture. And this is what I mean. Suppose you're an agency whose evaluations place a great deal of weight on problem solving and collaborating with the community, and they should. Suppose you're an agency whose reward system is built to recognize officers who engage the public in problem solving and collaboration, and it should. Suppose you're an agency who publicly recognizes officers for problem solving and collaboration, both in formal ceremonies and through social media, and you should. Finally, suppose you're an agency where communication comes from the top down. Nothing goes back up. All decisions and all solutions come from the chief and the command staff. An agency where avoidance is the most common form of conflict resolution used. Tell me how strongly those officers at that agency truly believe their leaders understand and value problem solving and collaboration. And tell me how long it will be before problem solving and collaboration are done at a level only sufficient enough to avoid punishment. If we expect and we demand from our officers problem solving and collaboration outside the walls of our agencies, we have to demand and expect the same thing inside the walls of our agencies. Employee engagement, problem solving, collaboration, shared leadership. Yes, that kind of culture, and you have to build a culture that supports that. That kind of culture will reduce our executive power as decision makers. I understand that. But think about what it will increase. Trust in the chief executive. Trust in the organization's leaders. Trust in the organization itself. The very results we want from our officers problem solving and collaborating with the community. And it just so happens that building trust and legitimacy, and that's the other thing that you get. If you have the trust of your officers, if you have the trust of your community, you have legitimacy. People will willingly follow legitimate leaders. A community will support and accept the authority of a legitimate police agency. And it just so happens that building trust and legitimacy is the first and the most important pillar of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And I want to close with a quote from that report that echoes what we've been talking about the last couple of days. Law enforcement culture should embrace a guardian rather than a warrior mindset to build trust and legitimacy. So back to that message at the beginning. We in law enforcement are the only thing standing in the way between the innocent and those wishing to do them harm. How do we start changing that message? First, we hire the right people. Second, we train them the right way. And third, we promote the right behaviors. Hire, train, and promote. Then we can look forward to a new message and attending a ceremony where law enforcement executives from around the country are being recognized for their personal development and professional development, and hearing one of the speakers say, "We in policing are proud to serve communities where all of us play a role in protecting each other from those wishing to do us harm." Thank you.
It's great to be in front of you here today. We've been 3 days at this conference on problem-based learning, police training officer, and new methods of training and development in our profession. It's been exciting to me to meet you. I consider the people who self-select themselves to come to this kind of a conference on progressive police reform to be the vanguard of what's happening in our profession. So in many ways, this talk is going to be preaching to the choir, but I'm doing it because I think we share some of these ideas, and I want to get the message out there that what you're doing matters and what you're doing is important to the field. Today I want to talk to you about 3 things, and only 3 things. I want to talk to you about a woman I met a number of years ago who lives in a community in New Orleans called Holly Grove. And she's a senior there. And the work I did was through our company that does urban development and community development and crime prevention. And we developed a program called Safe Growth, and it was about helping communities turn back from the brink of crime. And this organization was AARP, which works with 50 plus population trying to help them. And Miss Ruthie is a resident in this community called Holly Grove. And she's a really cool person as a senior and as a resident and as a citizen of our country. So I want to talk to you about Miss Ruthie. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to do, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to talk to you about the reality of policing and law enforcement today. I want to talk to you about what we actually do every single day. And thirdly, I want to talk to you a bit about how Miss Ruthie plays into what we can do in the future and what we need to do as a profession to become successful. So that's the 3 themes I want to talk to you about. So let's start at the beginning. Talk about where we are today, what we're doing, and what the reality is, what the image is. A couple of weeks ago, I was walking through a magazine, through a store into the magazine area, and I picked up a magazine. It was just a magazine on public affairs and city development, and it had a section on policing in there. And I figured through the document, and it was maybe a 100-page magazine about different types of policing type issues, and I came across pages, page after page after page, and they looked sort of the same. They looked like this. They looked like an advertisement for a tactical policing conference. The next page had a description of a police expo, which had a lot of armored personnel carriers, new weapon systems, new defenses, night goggles, and all the kinds of things that we hear about in training, but show up on these magazines with increasing regularity. The next page was this discussion here on the National Homeland Security Conference, which is a large event to talk about anti-terrorism and things we need to do to deal with terrible incidents like we had just recently in Orlando, and the horror that causes and the impact it causes in our communities. The next page was another conference advertisement about this, in this case, a tactical conference, about the tactics of policing and so forth, and on it went. It was a little disturbing to me. Not because I'm against tactics or against the so-called warrior ways, because I think that's always been a part of police work. It's always been a part of the job. When I was a police officer, we certainly had SWAT officers. We had that element to our job. We changed from revolvers over to different kinds of weapons. So the tactics of policing have changed. I want to ask you, though, has our training kept up? Has the training that we we did in the 1950s and the 1970s, where we were using revolvers. When the revolver shifted over to a new kind of weapon, did our training accompany that? That's a question I think we need to start asking. So I thought about this and I thought, well, what's the reality of our job? So I put this number up there, and I want you to have a look at the number on the screen. And the number is 694. And I want to ask you, what do you think that number represents? What do you think? Number of ice cream vendors who currently work through the summer months of our city? The number of times that police officers typically run into confrontations in the course of a year? That number isn't picked at random. The number was the product of a little research project I did about 2 weeks ago, looking at police incidents, crime incidents, violent incidents, and particularly the kinds of things that happened recently in Orlando, which was essentially a mass murder. And I thought to myself, well, how often do these mass murders happen, really? Are they getting worse? What is happening with the kinds of weapons that are being used? Is this an attack on the country by terrorists? What does it actually look like? And what I discovered was the terrorism-related murders that have happened in this country in the last 2 years totals to 694. Now, the numbers may be a little fuzzy because it's sometimes difficult to define what we mean by terrorism. So it may be a little more, maybe a little less. But generally speaking, that's generally what we're talking about here. 694 people have been killed in this country through the acts of terrorism over the last 2 years, when the data was available, most recently till the spring of this year in 2016. Well, what does that mean? What's the reality of that? Well, the reality of that is a terrible thing. The newspapers pick it and splash it in front of the headlines, as they should. But what's the daily experience of everyday average police officer in the country? Well, how many murders have there been over the past 2.5 years? The tally that I came up with using the FBI statistics was 28,000. And what's the reality of those events? The events that the everyday police officer, the homicide investigator, the criminal investigators, what is the experience that they run into? Is it like what we're seeing in Orlando? Is it the Al-Qaeda plots and the sleeper cells and the homegrown terrorists? What does that look like? What it actually looks like is domestic violence is the bulk of those murders, which has been the case since I was a cop and since I've been a criminologist and involved in planning and development. That's always been the case. Gangs and drugs. That hasn't really changed. So the question we want to say is 2.4 of all the actual murders that occur through the span of 2 years in this particular case are the reality of what you're seeing splashed across the headlines. But the truth of the matter is 97% is what we're actually dealing with in everyday life. And so we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to do in terms of dealing with situations of our job for real? The warrior strategies often come out of this belief that we're being flooded with terrorists at the gates. Well, there are terrorists at the gates, all right, and they exist inside the home of the everyday average family who suffers from dysfunction and drugs and alcohol. That's the terrorism. That's always been the terrorism. And it's the same thing for robbery, and it's the same thing for shootings, and it's the same thing for burglaries, and it's the same thing for everyday life. That's the reality of our job. And I think that's what we need to start thinking about. That if that's the reality, that's what we have to devise our training to focus on. That's what we have to devise our delivery, service strategies to become much better at. And so when we're looking at things like the curriculum in the academy, we have to look at how much time is spent on the tactical skills and how much time is spent on the interpersonal conflict resolution skills. If it's not at least 50-50, then we're in real trouble. So what does that mean for you? So that's the second thing I want to talk to you about. What do we do and what works? Over the last 25 years, there's been a major reform in our profession, not to do with warrior ways and not to do with tactics, to do with something not related to that at all. Now, we know about the warrior stuff. We know about the APC showing up the door. We know about all that. But do we really know about the biggest major reform in our profession in the last 2.5 decades that has made a major impact on crime and safety? And I mean major crime reductions and so forth. And I'm referring to a strategy that came out of the 70s and 80s called problem-oriented policing, or POP. And POP has been around for a long time, and it has had tremendous impacts. And as a result of the POP reforms, there's been books, and there's been hand guide books and guidelines on how to tackle certain kinds of crimes. There's been training programs, there's been conferences, and on and on and on. I've been part of this problem-oriented policing movement for a long time. As a matter of fact, the reason you're here today to talk about problem-based learning and police training officer and all the kinds of police training reforms is because a number of folks that I work with in the POP movement got together and said, we need to create a training program that aligns with the problem-oriented policing strategy. That's why you're here today. And the fellow who created POP wrote about it is a fellow by the name of Herman Goldstein, retired professor out of the University of Madison, or University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it struck me last year when we had our conference in Madison, and I said to the audience, and Herman Goldstein lives there, and he was in the audience. And I said, how many of you in the audience here can talk a bit about problem-oriented policing, or POP? And it was stunning. After 3 decades of this, only about 3 hands went up. That's a shock. It's a shock because all the resources at our disposal are right in front of us. One of the guidebooks, robbery of taxi drivers, how to solve that, how to deal with that, how communities have tackled with that. Pedestrian injuries and fatalities, how to deal with that. These are guidebooks that are developed by other officers around the country tackling difficult issues, the 97%. Sexual assault by women and strangers, how to deal with that. Home invasion robberies. How many in this room have seen 70 guidelines just like this? How many have read these? How many have seen these? How many? Let me see a show of hands. Yeah, that's what I had last year. Malcolm Sparrow is an academic at Harvard who was a former police officer. He wrote this book a couple of months ago called Handcuffed: What Holds Policing Back? The 2 Keys to Reform. One of the chapters in Malcolm Sparrow's book is the decline of problem-oriented policing and community policing. In other words, boom, pops out. We have to do better. So, how does Miss Ruthie come into it? Miss Ruthie is a senior from the neighborhood of Hollygrove. She's lived there her whole life. Since the Katrina storms in '05, the gangs moved back, and the 3,000 residents were besieged by decades of crime, what had been going on for decades. And Miss Ruthie and their organization called ARP got together and decided to try to make that community more livable. The police weren't helping in that particular case. City Council wasn't helping in that particular case. We were asked to go and work with the residents, develop this program called Safe Growth, which is not a police-based program, by the way. It's a community-based neighborhood development program. Started with crime prevention using environmental design and morphed into the next generation, which we now call Safe Growth. Over the period of a couple of months, we helped work with the residents, work with the local community, work with the local architects, work with the social workers, and work with some of the local beat officers, developing strategies to tackle problems in Hollygrove. I'm talking about a community of 3,000 residents with 25, 26, 27 homicides every year. 3,000 residents. That's a homicide rate that's far in excess of anywhere else in the world. These residents are suffering the consequences. Miss Ruthie, an African-American community in which Miss Ruthie has lived her whole life, are suffering the consequences of that terrorism. That's real terrorism. And so we got together and we started to develop programs. And Miss Ruthie was fascinating. Miss Ruthie started with a program that we never thought would work. And it was a get back to the street and walk for health. Have seniors walk the streets for health. That's how it started. And so Miss Ruthie and some of the seniors started walking. Now, keep in mind that the gang drug dealers on the corner are relatives, many are relatives, of people they know. This is their neighborhood, and they're saying to them, this is our neighborhood, we're taking it back. And Miss Ruthie called the program Soul Steppers, which is a very cool name. And they started walking. And within a few weeks, the Soul Stepper programs went from 10, 20, 30 residents to 100 residents. And all of a sudden, the residents are coming out, and they're engaging. And we started doing things like getting new lights, trimming the hedges, doing some crime prevention designs, taking care of the abandoned buildings. And by the way, the police involvement in these first year or so was almost zero. They did this on their own. They actually got together and worked as a team. They organized themselves, and through being trained and through the programming that ARP and our team helped them to do. And this made a massive difference. And it started a momentum of change. And within about a year, we started to get organizations coming who wanted to build parks for the children and rebuild the senior center and putting in new lights and establishing areas of the community where people could congregate and work, like a garden center and a community garden, where they started to sell the produce for resources to a poor community. I love the part where the local politicians all made comments about how they were going to change things in the neighborhood, and the residents watched carefully. And when the election happened and the politicians did not make many changes, what the locals did was they took the election signs, because they had no street signs. They took the election signs, turned them backwards, and they wrote the names of the streets, and they used those as their street signs. So every time you walked down the street, you knew exactly who the sign was, because the other side had the election sign for the politician who didn't do anything. On this side had the street name. Talk about empowered. Talk about real empowered. And so Miss Ruthie led to, and her organization and her community led to a major change. And eventually, after 2 years, we were able to get the police to really take a major role in shutting down some of the drug houses and shutting down some of the real high crime areas, and we made a bigger impact on the crime. And we went from 25, 26, 27 homicides down to last year we had 2. Now 2 is a terrible thing, don't get me wrong, and the problems are not gone. But Holly Grove is a far much better place today than it was 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. Tremendous. That's where we need to go in our profession. That's the real terrorism that I think is so important. And for the sake of people like Miss Ruthie and the citizens of our country, I think that's what we need to dedicate ourselves to. Thank you.
Good morning, almost afternoon, everybody. Thank you. For those of you who don't know me really quickly, I'm Michelle Wyatt. I work for the Virginia Beach Police Department. And I've been told that I'm not allowed to pace around, so I'm going to really try to stand in one spot, but that really goes against my nature altogether. But what I'm going to review a little bit, go over, is PBL and the Academy and our culture, okay? We talked a little bit about it in one of our sessions earlier on Wednesday, I believe it was. Didn't really get to what my staff and I are trying to do within the Academy setting. So basically, what is the current climate of training right now? How do we train our recruits? We are set up in very similar fashion as we are right now, correct? We have logical linear, seats, rows, tables that are right behind one another, and then we use the crutch, as we call it, of PowerPoint. And we call that death by PowerPoint. We've all been in that class, right? Oh my God, how am I going to get through this next 8 hours of 45 slides, 75 slides, and then worse off, the instructor reading off of that slide. So when we talk about that, what does that accomplish for us? What is that? We have to ask ourselves, what does death by PowerPoint accomplish for the training mission? What it accomplishes is, it accomplishes the standards. That's all. In Virginia Beach, it's the DCGS standards. Our academy has to accomplish around 1,400 standards in order to be a certified police officer. So death by PowerPoint, we can put the standard in there, and then we can tell DCGS that they've accomplished the standard. But can we truly say that they understand it? Is it understanding for them when we go, okay, there it is, it was in the PowerPoint, and you were present in the class, but are they truly getting that message? And what is we have to ask ourselves, what is the focus? Who is the focus in that classroom? The instructor is the focus. The instructor is standing up there, look at me, I'm going to tell you all about this subject that I have. But does that really matter? It doesn't matter, right? The student needs to be the focus. The student needs to be the one that is getting this information. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we change that training culture? Can we change that training culture? What we need to do is take PBL into the academy. That's how we change this culture. PBL is student-centered. and it's their responsibility to get the work. Excuse me. The instructor stands back and facilitates these things versus me standing up there telling you exactly what we need to know. This is how we accomplish this. We need to think about who is the most important person in that room. Is it me as the instructor and the subject matter expert? Or is it the student that knows nothing about police work and we're trying to teach them about police work, go out there and accomplish it and be very effective? Well, I think that we could all sit here and say that the student is the most important person in that classroom. And we do nothing to facilitate that, at least in my academy. I can tell you that I've gone into our academy several times, and it's death by PowerPoint, and worse off, there's an instructor reading directly off of the slide, which drives me crazy. And our students are completely unengaged. They are completely not engaged at all. They are given the PowerPoint previously, so they don't even need to follow along. They don't write notes. They don't do anything. They're thinking about, okay, it's 10 minutes to 11. It's time for lunch here. Can't wait for that. And it's 10 minutes to 3. It's time to PT in 5 minutes. That's all they're thinking about. They're not engaged at all. Because why are they not engaged, we ask ourselves? Because it's not relevant to them. We have to bring in adult learning principles into the academy. And one of those things is relevance. How is this relevant to my training? How is it relevant to me being a police officer? And that relevance is going to make them engaged and want to learn and want to find out more things. So we bring in PBL. In my academy, every chance I get, if there's downtime, if they have a staff day or they're doing remediations or something, me and my staff, we go down there and we do PBL stuff. I put them in groups and they see me come in the door and they're like, oh, here comes Sergeant Wyatt. We're going to get some PBL done. We're going to do some stuff. And they are so engaged. They love it. They go out, they learn their things. I do pulse teaching, I do group work. And then we discuss it as groups. It's not me standing up there going, you need to learn this, and this is the way you learn it, and this is what you should do. Because in police work, there are many different ways, right? If I were to go out and do a traffic stop, and somebody else would go out and do a traffic stop, there is a real good chance that we would do it completely different. But in the end, we both do it safely. We both are given the citations that are needed, or the warning, and so on. And we go home at the end of the day. So isn't that the biggest accomplishment that we need, right? We need to go home at the end of the day. And if they do it something differently, then let's go with it. So what we talk about is, what does PBL accomplish for us in the training academy? What does it really give us as police trainers? Well, I'll tell you that it gives us, again, it develops relevance to the problems in the instruction. It gives them ownership into what's going on. If they are involved in their own learning and creating projects or creating lesson plans or creating something that they have to teach back to their own class, that's ownership for that, and they don't want to look stupid, and they want to be, they want to be able to give that information back to their fellow students. So that's ownership. It's huge for us. It develops critical thinking. Critical thinking is huge for us in police work. At a moment's notice, we've got to make quick decisions. We've got to be able to think of everything and put everything together. Because, if we go to a call, a domestic call or something like that, we don't have our class behind us going, hey, we should do this, hey, we should do that. We have to develop that critical thinking right then and there to be able to accomplish this. So problem-based learning develops critical thinking, something that we have lacked in police work, or at least police training, for a very long time. And after we talk about problem-based learning, then we ask ourselves, how does our leadership, our city councils, our citizens benefit from utilizing PBL into the academy, into our training? How does it benefit us? We have to ask that question. Well, I'll tell you that it's the greatest answer for all of those people, and it's that we develop problem solvers. Problem solvers. They're going out, they're tackling the problems. It's amazing to get a recruit that has been taught problem solving in the academy, taught problem solving in PTO training, and then comes out and is on their own and actually solves a problem without somebody telling them to do it, with their own drive and self-awareness and self-motivation. We've given them problem solvers right then and there. And I didn't even have to do anything as a supervisor. And that benefits everybody. Our city council will love it. Matter of fact, our city council was in contact with one of our PPOs, and in one of our problem neighborhoods, our city manager is actually direct contact with our officer and fixing a problem that he developed or he identified, worked with the community, and then now they're getting that problem fixed for the community. I think that's huge, right? That's absolutely huge. We give problem solvers to our city council, our leadership looks good, and they enjoy that, and of course our citizens benefit exponentially. So as students here and attendees into this conference, I would ask you that you guys go back to your training units and ask yourselves, or ask the training units, what are we doing to facilitate problem solvers? What are we doing to facilitate the adult learners in there? And is there a way that we can change that culture? For me in Virginia Beach, I have forced myself into those positions to be able to go down there and insert PBL. And it's a struggle. It's not something that somebody wants to do right away, or somebody is willing to create this, but I am putting myself in there. And it's benefiting, and I'm showing that to my command staff. I'm showing that to my captains and my lieutenants that this works. So I would ask yourselves to go in there. If you are a general instructor, or if you are a specialized instructor, and you sit up there and you have a PowerPoint that is more than 10 slides, you need to ask yourself, who does that benefit and who is the focus of that presentation? And if you come up with me, then you need to revisit that and rebuild and try to develop it where it's more relevant to the student. So all in all, PBL in the academy, it is a great way to get problem solvers, and most importantly, who benefits from that? City council, leadership, and most importantly, the citizens that the city that you serve. Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by stating an assumption that I have. That assumption is that I can change an organization, and that if I can do it, you can do it too. Some of you know me as a retired sergeant from a very busy Bay Area police agency. I currently work for an organization that has a bit of dysfunction. Training wasn't very prioritized. It was kind of a good old boy network, in fact. So the plum assignments went to the friends of the people who were in charge. And we had new people coming in who essentially were going out and not doing a very good job for our organization. So I'd like to tell you a story about how I worked to change an organization. And this story has nothing to do with police work. The story is actually about umpiring, because the organization that I'm talking about, and the organization that I'm talking about changing, was the high school umpiring group that I work with. That's not me, that's a friend of mine. The job of umpiring is very much like the job that we do in police work. We wear a uniform, we take pride in it. We work as a team. In fact, when we walk out onto the baseball field, we know that there's 2 baseball teams there. We consider ourselves the 3rd team. So we actually call ourselves the 3rd team. We're actually the team that never loses. We like that. So we also have a rule book. This may sound familiar to us as police officers. We have to enforce the rule book. We have to make observations throughout the game and then immediately apply the rule book to whatever it is that we see. And we have to be prepared after making any decision to justify that decision very quickly, orally, with good conflict resolution skills. The job of umpiring is very much like being a police officer. So I've been doing it for about 20 years. I worked for an organization that was fairly stable for many years. We had the same president. He basically did things the same way every time, and he was a great storyteller, and he was the wise sage on the stage, and we all looked up to him, we all revered him. When it came to training, every year we do an umpire clinic, preparatory to the high school season starting. And the clinic is a 1 or 2 day training session for all of our umpires, including new umpires, and we train them the way that we want umpiring to be done in our organization. And the way that it was done about 10 years ago under the old regime was that the president would choose a group of guys who were friends of his who were good umpires, and he would kind of put together the clinic to talk about the things that he wanted to talk about and teach people the things that he wanted to talk about. He kind of gave some assignments to the people that he was considering trainers for that clinic, and then the trainers would kind of muddle through doing what they had always done on the field. If you want to call strikes, you do it this way. If you want to get from here to here, this is how you do it. If somebody comes out of the dugout to argue with you, this is how I deal with it, so this is how you should deal with it. And recognize that there was some issues with that. Eventually, that president decided to retire. He needed to because his hips were bad. And I moved into onto the board of our umpiring organization, and I became the vice president. And the vice president's role was to deal with training. So I took what was a fairly disorganized group of people who didn't really value training or know much about adult learning, and I decided that I needed to change the culture of our organization. So for this next slide, I'd like you to think about a Russian nesting doll. In your mind, you know what that is. It's the doll, and you take one out, and then you open it up, and another smaller one comes out, and another smaller one comes out. So I wanted to change the culture of our organization. But I knew that I couldn't just say, hey fellas, we need to change the culture of our organization, and it would happen. It doesn't work that way. In our organization, the culture was determined based on the behaviors that people had, how they responded to training, how they went out onto the field and did their job as an umpire on the high school baseball field, how they were willing to engage in our training program or not, whether they were willing to work on their own game or not. I may or may not have had some influence on their behaviors, but to be honest with you, they got to choose their behaviors, and I didn't really think that I could have much influence on that. The umpires have a certain level of capability. Not all of our umpires work at the varsity level. Some of our umpires work in the freshman level, and that's all the games that they get. Some of them can work in the JV level, and some of them can work JV and varsity games. So not everybody has the same capabilities. Sometimes speed on the field is important, sometimes decision making is important, Sometimes being able to manage conflict is the key thing for whether or not you're a freshman umpire or a varsity umpire, because at the higher levels, those coaches take it pretty seriously, and they will get in your face, even at the high school level. I can't really change their capabilities necessarily directly by just addressing capabilities. They have a certain set of beliefs and values about the game and about training and teaching. So I realized that one of the things that I could do is I could take a group of people who saw themselves as umpires and believe that that was their primary role, and I might be able to change that belief to make them think of themselves as trainers or teachers who umpire. So instead of being umpires who teach, I wanted them to think about themselves and believe that they were teachers who umpire. So I really wanted to shift their values, because what I really wanted to do is I wanted to shift a group of trainers' identity. I wanted a group of people who actually saw themselves as teachers in our umpiring organization group. And what I needed to do was give them a mission. So what I did, and this took place, this started about 6-7 years ago. So I've been working on this for a while. What I did is I identified the mission, and that was that we needed to change our organization one person at a time by learning to value training, and that we needed to have a training group, a dedicated cadre of umpire trainers who saw themselves as teachers, who were there to teach the third team. So recognizing that there were some indicators, the history that I talked about in our culture, there were some work avoidance patterns. People came to the clinics and they either participated or they didn't. The trainers were kind of on-again, off-again trainers, recognizing that that was happening. I decided that I needed to, one, act politically. So for my position on the board, I began massaging this idea with the other members of the board, and I got some support. And then I was able to separate the training coordinator, the training position away from the vice presidency, because I didn't really want to become a president anyway. So I separated myself and created a whole new training director position on the board. We got somebody else to fill the vice president role, and I became a training director. So acting politically, that helped me to be able to orchestrate some conflict. Orchestrating some conflict created an adaptive culture where now our organization was in the mode of being able to do some adaptive work to change their identity and maybe even some beliefs and values, at least among the training staff that I was trying to develop. After having orchestrated some conflict and getting, one of the things that I did was I selected a group of trainers. People that I didn't necessarily want to have to be the best umpires in our group. They didn't have to be the best umpires in the group. They needed to be capable, qualified, respected people in our group. But what they really needed to be was the right people. They needed to be people who I knew could work in an environment where they could take on extra work, where I believed that they could change their beliefs and values and maybe take on the new identity of being a trainer, teacher, as well as being an umpire. So that created some conflict, because who was chosen and who wasn't chosen created that adaptive environment where we could get some work done and I could keep moving forward. So I had to create some interventions, because to change their identity, to change this group of 20 guys that I had, and I'm using the word guys because our group was all men at the time, to change their identity from umpire to teacher, I needed to make sure that they had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to move from umpire to teacher. we started holding meetings. I found out that they didn't know much about adult learning, so I taught them. Taught them about adult learning concepts. I taught them about Knowles' principles of adult learning. I taught them about Bloom's taxonomy. That raised the heat again, orchestrated some more conflict because they had no idea why I was teaching them about Bloom's taxonomy. It was actually fascinating to watch, but when they were uncomfortable, it continued that adaptive environment where we could get some work done to change some beliefs and values about their identity. My loyalties in this was to the organization itself. I wanted every umpire who walked out onto the field to feel confident in their abilities to manage conflict, to call a game, and be good at it, and not have too many people yelling at you because, like I said, umpiring is like police work. People will yell at you. So I wanted to make sure that everybody in the organization could get to the varsity level if it was possible. My purpose was to develop a training cadre that became leaders within the organization so that those who were not in the training program or were not designated trainers, people who were not in there could go and talk to them and know that they were getting the right answer. So one of the things that I emphasized was that we don't want to teach them what you do or what you do on the field or what you do on the field. We want to teach them as a group. This is what our organization teaches. Our organization is the Contra Costa Umpires Association, so CCUA. This is what CCUA teaches. In this situation, this is what CCUA wants you to do. And we had to get out of the I mindset of, well, this is what I would do. This is how I would do it. Doing that, I developed some leadership capacities. And we started having umpire trainers who basically were applying adult learning concepts to our organization. And when they began to value themselves as teachers and began to value education and training for what it was, the rest of the organization began to value the training because the training increased exponentially in the quality of the training. So it was actually fun. And as I said, I've been doing this now for about 6 or 7 years. So how does PBL come into it? PBL comes into it because every year, at the beginning of our preparation for the high school season, the high school season usually starts around February. So by about October, November, I have to think about this. I have to go through the ideas of what can I do this year and what do I know about where we've been? And I need to figure out what I need to learn, and I need to figure out what they need to learn. I need to solve that issue. And then I need to come up with a plan, and then I need to evaluate, and I do the evaluation throughout, but at the end of the year, I begin again. So that's how I used PBL to implement a value shift or a culture shift in our organization. We've gotten to the point now after 6 or 7 years that these umpires who were going out onto the field and they believed that their job was to call balls and strikes and safes and outs and fairs and fouls, now in this last rotation for our last season, which just ended a couple of months ago, I had umpire trainers who were writing curriculum, lesson plans for our clinic. So instead of having one guy having a group of people who were his friends develop the clinic, the umpires trainers themselves were actually writing, developing, creating new lesson plans, and then delivering them on the field. To me, that was a critical value shift in what their identity was. And so I would say that it is possible using the Dilts change model, which is the nesting dolls, and the adaptive leadership model, which there's a book called Leadership on the Line, you can find that. Using those things together, I was able to change our organization for the better. We now do have better training, we do have better umpires out on the field, and we do value, as a culture, as an organization, training in a totally different way than we did 10 years ago. And I would argue that if I can do it in that kind of an organization, you can do it in your organization. That's it. Thanks.